Hello again and welcome to the program. I am Suren. A very long time ago, as the story goes, during the lifetime of Greek philosopher Plato, circa 427 to 347 BC, the people of Delos were struck down by a terrible pestilence. In extreme despair, they all consulted the oracles, for that was all they knew, asking what steps they should take. Alas, the oracle has sent them a problem. As we discover, they were to double the volume of a cubic altar, while preserving its shape. The governors went to the geometers of the academy, imploring them to find the answer to save their city. In fact, to solve this problem, it was necessary to find the cubic root of 2. That's all. But with the mathematics that the ancient Greeks had at their disposal, this was impossible. So the problem set by the oracle, somebody, was considered mischievous. But the story does show how highly geometry, which actually means measuring the earth, was regarded in ancient Greece. Greek geometers inherited the knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, who, in the 3rd millennium BC, first developed this science as a practical method of surveying or measuring their land. Once every year, the flooding of the river Nile obviously wiped off or destroyed all the boundary markers at the time within its alluvial plain, and these had to be redone by central government in order to prevent any possible disputes among the landowners. This method of surveying had to be very simple, but accurate, and it had to facilitate the measurement of both length and the area they occupied or owned. To achieve this, what was required was an easy method, or producing the right angle for them. Now, how did they do the forming a right angle? Question mark. The solution adopted by the ancient Egyptians involved 2 men and the length of a rope with 13 knots in it, marking 12 equal divisions. Laid out straight, the rope could be used for measuring distances, and by arranging it in the shape of a triangle, with one side 3 units long, another 4, and another 5. Right angle was formed. Using this simple method, it was also easy to lay out rectangles and other more complex geometrical figures. And the method was used in particular for laying out the foundations of sacred buildings. In ancient Egypt, the priests organized and controlled religion pervaded life to such an extent that almost every action was a ritualistic act of worship. The very laying out of tombs and temples involved the most complex ceremonies. There has been much speculation about the significance of the dimensions of ancient Egyptian buildings, in particular the pyramids. But there is no doubt that every aspect of Egyptian sacred building was, in fact, infused with religious symbolism. Various cultures have chosen different ways to enrich their buildings with symbolic and often religious meanings. The Tower of Babel, for instance, the Babylonian Etemenanki, for example, was designed as a miniature representation of the universe with 7 stages, each representing one of the 7 heavens of Babylonian cosmology. Each level was identified with a planet and painted in a corresponding color. The bottom layer was painted in black to represent Saturn. The next one was orange for Jupiter, the third red for Mars, the fourth yellow for the Sun, the fifth and sixth green and blue for Venus and Mercury, and the top white, probably for the Moon. The Old Testament, in fact, contains many detailed descriptions of buildings, obviously designed as physical expressions of the ancient Jewish art of gematria, or number symbolism. In addition, dimensions are believed to have been received by direct revelation from God, and clearly had a transcendent significance. For instance, the instructions for the construction of the ark began in this way, according to the Bible's Genesis chapter 6, verses 14 to 16. We read, "And this is the fashion which thou shalt make it. Of the length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make to the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above, and the door of the ark shalt thou set in the side thereof. With lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it." The ark was thus divided into 3 stories, each with 11 sections, which of course gives a total of what is considered a sacred number, 33. The ark is known to have had 2 openings. The main entrance in the lowest story, through which the animals passed into the plane of physical life, and a small 1-cubit window at the top, through which the spirit, in the shape of the dove that Noah sent out to look for land at the height of the flood, was released in his book, The Canon. William Sterling goes so far as to connect the dimensions of the ark with the size of the planet Earth. Amazingly fanciful as they may seem, such cosmological schemata can be found throughout ancient architecture, particularly in Egypt and Babylonia. Indeed, the art is, as one discovers in many ways, the image of the righteous man, who is taken away from an old and evil world and placed into a new and God-given plan. Some would even say that those who fit the cosmic scheme survive. Those who do not perish. For the ancient Greeks, and of course Plato in particular, it was also in geometry that the harmony of the cosmos could be expressed. For them, the world was governed by the proportions given by the two geometric progressions of Pythagoras, 1, 2, 4, 8, and 1, 3, 9, 27. And in his work, Timaeus, Plato went on to assert that the forms that best reflected to this harmony were cubes and squares with sides in these specific proportions. The four elements, let's talk about them. For later Platonists, geometry even accounted for all known states of matter. That's why I mentioned the four elements. Especially important were the series of Platonic solids, four of which represented the four elements. The tetrahedron being the simplest, regular geometric solid, represented fire. The lightest of the elements, the octahedron, bounded by 8 equilateral triangles and considered next in lightness to the tetrahedron, was assigned to air. Then came the cube, a solid and immovable figure that stood for the element of earth, while icosahedron, the heaviest of the regular solids, bounded by triangles, represented water. An extraordinary footnote to the symbolism of the Platonic solids is the discovery in Britain of a series of spherical stones, at least 1,000 years old, carved to represent the same solids. Indeed, the sitting and construction of many ancient megalithic monuments seem to indicate a wealth of sophisticated astronomical and geometrical knowledge on the part of their builders. For other civilizations, the reflection of divine harmony in the proportions of buildings was a less abstract matter. If God made man, so they thought, then the proportions of the human body must echo the harmony of the divine plan. Now, Hindu architectural sutra says the universe is present in the temple by means of proportion. And the Hindu temple plan can be superimposed on the body of the Purusha, or cosmic man. In Western tradition, the same idea is found in the work of the architectural theoretician Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, more commonly known simply as Vitruvius. This Roman, who worked in the 1st century BC, codified his rules for good building in his 10 books. De Architectura, of architecture. After the fall of the Roman Empire, his books were lost for a millennium, until this rediscovered by the architects of the Renaissance, through whom, in their effort to recreate the classical architecture, their architectura gained a stature far greater than any other importance it had enjoyed in classical times. According to Vitruvius, architecture depends on order, arrangement, eurythmy, beauty, and fitness in the relationship of the parts of the building to the whole symmetry, propriety, and economy. Eurythmy is achieved, said Vitruvius, through an elaborate system of proportion. In temples, this proportion is to be derived from the proportions of the human body, which he declared had been formed with such propriety that the several members are commensurate with the whole. No building, he asserted, can possess the attributes of composition in which symmetry and proportion are disregarded. And unless there exists the perfect conformation of parts which may be observed in a well-formed human being. Let's talk about some vital statistics. This foundation of the proportions of architecture and those of the human body was also taken up with enthusiasm by the architects of the Renaissance. Proportions were worked out explicitly and in detail and employed in church facades, in foundations, and in paintings. In particular, dimensions were related via geometric and harmonic proportions. In 1525, Franciscan monk named Francesco di Giorgio published a treatise entitled De Harmonia Mundi Totius, concerning the harmony of the whole world, that effectively blended the Platonic, geometrical tradition, aspects of the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, and Vitruvius' system, based as it was on the proportions of the human body. The quality which Vitruvius called propriety was defined by him as the perfection of style that can only result from the correct construction of a building, and he was to record the correct rules for building in the classical tradition. Among them, explicit guidelines for the use of the various types of classical columns: Corinthian, Ionic, and Doric, in temples dedicated to the various gods. Doric was to be used for temples in honor of Jupiter, lightning, the heavens, the sun or the moon, Minerva, Mars, or Hercules. Corinthian for Venus, Proserpine, spring water, and nymphs, and Ionic for Juno, Diana, and Bacchus, and others. So-called propriety was also to be achieved by the correct sitting of the building. Temples were to be built in healthy neighborhoods where suitable springs of fresh water existed, and where to be oriented in such a way that the light could be used to the maximum effect. The ancient Chinese art of geomancy, or feng shui, was and still is concerned precisely with such questions. It is essentially a method of ensuring the propitious sitting of buildings in the surrounding physical terrain. To the ancient mind, however, such propitious building was not merely a matter of analyzing the physical characteristics of the surrounding countryside. Buildings were also designed to reflect the harmony between man and the universe. Now I will be talking to you a little bit about psychics confronting physicists. Let us talk about the psychic discoveries of the 19th century, which were found to conflict with the traditional picture of the universe. And complacency was shaken as scientists now became forced to adapt their own rational ideas. The greatest obstacle to acceptance of paranormal events is not the lack of evidence, but the unfortunately firmly entrenched belief that such events are impossible. Many eminent psychical researchers have drawn attention to this, and much to their dismay, some have even discovered it, yes, in themselves. Professor Charles Richet, a renowned physiologist and Nobel laureate, as well as a keen, skeptical, and long-term researcher into alleged psychic phenomena, wrote the following after his carefully conducted series of tests on Eusapia Palladino, the famous, though somewhat notorious, physical medium. He writes, "But at this point, a remarkable psychological phenomenon made itself felt. Her phenomenon deserving of all your attention. Observe that we are now dealing with observed facts, which are nevertheless absurd, which are in contradiction with facts of daily observation, which are denied not by science only, but by the whole of humanity. Facts which are rapid and fugitive, which take place in darkness and almost by surprise, with no proof except the testimony of our senses, which we know to be often fallible. After we have witnessed such facts, everything concurs to make us doubt them. Now, at the moment when these facts take place, they seem to us certain that we are willing to proclaim them openly. But when we return to ourselves, when we feel the irresistible influence of our environment, when our friends all laugh at our credulity, then we are almost disarmed, and we begin to doubt. May it not all have been an illusion? May I not have been deceived? And then, as the moment of the experiment becomes more remote, that experiment, which once seemed so conclusive, gets to seem more and more uncertain, and we end by letting ourselves be persuaded that we have been the victims of a trick. Everard Fielding, one of the most cautious investigators of the paranormal, also testified to the disorienteering effect of prolonged contact with the apparently incredible. He says, "The effect of all this on my mind was singular. I appeared to lose touch with actualities. Once admit the possibility of such things, and the fact of investigating them implied such an admission. Where could one stop? I wrote at the time that I had gradually begun to feel that if a man seriously told me that the statue of the Albert Memorial had cooled into tea, I should have to admit that the question to be solved would not be the sanity of the narrator, but the evidence for the fact." That brings us to a subject of closed minds. Walter Franklin Prince, in his book The Enchanted Boundary, wrote of the strange spell which psychic phenomena seem to cast over many respectable men of science. They became so immediately antagonistic to the claims of psychical researchers, he said, that without bothering to examine the evidence, they commonly rushed into condemnatory print in terms so strongly emotive that in any other field of scientific research, they would lose any reputation, previously enjoyed. A belief in the impossibility of psychic phenomena was largely created because of the successes of the 19th century science. It explained the host of celestial phenomena by applying Newton's law of gravitation and his laws of motion, and had even predicted the existence of the planet Neptune on the basis of its gravitational effects before it was discovered by means of telescopes. Science also came to understand a wide variety of natural phenomena, integrating into a seemingly universal theory of the physical world a large number of formerly separate fields, such as heat, light, electricity, and magnetism. Clerk-Maxwell's equations, for instance, gave an almost complete understanding of the electromagnetic field, leading ultimately to radio. In technology, too, man's increasing use of his newly acquired knowledge in building bridges, ships, factories, and trains, aeroplanes, demonstrated how firmly based his mastery of science was. It was therefore not surprising that the only fear of scientists towards the end of the 19th century was that there seemed few, if any, jungles of ignorance left. One scientist even expressed the belief that most scientific effort would henceforth be devoted merely to measuring physical constants to more and more decimal places. Well, in this climate of opinion, most informed people believed the space, time, mass, the atom, energy, and so on were already clearly understood. Our body was thought to be made up of hard billiard ball like atoms, each with a well-defined position and velocity. One could describe its shape, one could describe its space coordinates, its position, to any desires, or to any desired degree of accuracy, and by bringing in Newtonian time, which flowed uniformly, the rate of change of its space coordinates, its speed, could be expressed uniquely. Matter was indestructible. It could change its form from solid to liquid to gas, but it could never disappear or appear. Energy, likewise, was indestructible, though it too could change its form. Here is some food for thought. It also seemed as if the functions of plants and animals could ultimately be resolved into psychical, physical, and chemical processes. The nature of man, too, was beginning to be understood. The great physiologists and neurologists, such as Hewlings-Jackson, seemed to be demonstrating by their pioneer studies of neural processes that a sound mind presupposed a sound brain. The impairment of personality and mental functions caused by brain lesions of various kinds even led many to the belief that the concept of mind was superfluous. More and more researchers were adhering to epiphenomenalism, which asserted that mental events were purely a side effect of brain activity, reflecting it but not influencing it, so that an understanding of brain activity would be sufficient for an understanding of all mental processes. Two other major theories, meanwhile, begin to lose their adherence at this time. Parallelism regarded mental and neural events as running in parallel, without either being the cause of the other. This made understanding of the brain sufficient for scientific purposes. Interactionism maintained that mind was as real as brain, existing separately from it, yet interacting with it. This would make an understanding of mental processes dependent on, but not entirely reducible to, processes in the brain. Very few thinkers at the end of the 19th century still believed this. Again, what about life and death? We spoke about it. But now, as far as the soul was concerned, it is fair to say that a good proportion of intelligent people refused to entertain such an outmoded and elusive concept. Lip service was still paid to the church, but more and more death was looked upon as the final annihilator of all human hopes. Most people, in fact, refuse to think seriously about it at all until faced by the grim reality. Now, Frederick Myers, the great pioneer of psychical research, was once in the company of a Victorian businessman whom he attempted to engage in conversation about man's possible survival after death. The businessman was obviously uneasy and embarrassed, refusing to discuss the matter. Finally, Myers asked point blank, "What do you think will happen to you when you die?" His companion's answer was, "Why, I suppose I will enter into the joy of my Lord. But why talk about such an unpleasant subject?" Imagine. It is no wonder then that the alleged phenomena studied by psychical researchers found no lodging in the house of late 19th century science. Telepathy, clairvoyance, psychokinesis, precognition, and retrocognition. All these branches of the paranormal were inexplicable, at least according to the 19th century world model. And what about the bizarre phenomena of the seance room, where mediums commonly went into trances, were controlled by so-called spirit guides, and claimed to bring together spirits of the dead and those still incarnate in this world? ? These phenomena were widely thought to be downright impossible. Only a deluded and gullible fool would believe them, and most scientists either ignored or dismissed them with generalities about faulty reporting, fraud, and human gullibility. Let's talk about great minds for a moment. Among psychical researchers over the next century, there were to be numbered some of the keenest and best trained minds in Europe and the United States. For example, among presidents of the British Society for Psychical Research, many have held chairs in science or philosophy at major universities, and several have been fellows of the Royal Society, have held the Order of Merit or Nobel laureates. Such eminent researchers have included the physicists Lord Rayleigh, J. Thomson, and Sir Oliver Lodge, the philosophers Henry Bergson and Henry Sidgwick, and many others, equally renowned for their intellect. Fortunately, over the years, the critical and condemnatory atmosphere of former times has to a great extent changed. Controlled experimental psychical research has confirmed the occurrence of many types of psychic phenomena, such as telepathy, clairvoyance, psychometry, precognition, and psychokinesis. And for around half a century, ever since the pioneering researchers of J.B. Rhine in the Parapsychological Laboratory at Duke University in North Carolina, USA, workers in various parts of the world have conducted carefully controlled experiments on the paranormal and have amassed results that could not be due to mere chance. Indeed, if these had been produced in some other respectable research field, they would have been universally accepted as valid. Now, New World View. The new climate of opinion among scientists is mainly due to a growing realization that the old model of the universe is no longer valid. Physicists of the 20th century have already demolished the old structure and in its place installed a model possessing such wild properties that it makes the world of paranormal phenomena appear state. Thus, with the construction of a new scientific worldview, it no longer seems at all impossible that paranormal phenomena can be reconciled with science. It might even be said that orthodox science has now forfeited its claim to be the sole guardian of progress. What is more, it is no longer regarded as possessing a veto over claims formerly considered no more than superstitious in origin. At last, we are opening up to the paranormal so that physicists and psychics can achieve more together than mere confrontation. There is indeed much about the supernatural earth that it is to be hoped they will discover together. With this, today's program ends. I will meet you again by the next episode. Until then, keep smiling and be happy. Thank you.